Hello and welcome to Red Books. I'm here with Kieran O'Brien today. Kieran is a dealer of books and antiquated collectibles from South Wexford. He's also the organiser of the Wexford Book Fair for the last decade. Kieran, you've spent a life trading in books and antiquities. Can you remember the first book that you came across, the first book that made an impact on you?
Well, the first book I ever read, actually, apart from a school book, was Treasure Island. And then I read Robinson Crusoe after that. I was sick actually. I was about 12 and I picked it up and started to read it. And then that was it then. From that on then I was reading constantly through my teenage years. But a cousin of mine and myself, we set up a sort of an antique business back in the 70s. And we were trading a bit. He got an auctioneer's license. We were doing auctions as well, and we were organising fairs. I was collecting and selling coins, and then books came into it eventually. The first big lot of books we bought some fine antique bookcases out of a big house. It was about 30-foot bookcases, and they were full of books. We had to take the books with the bookcases. So we wondered what we're going to do with all these books, so we set up a sort of a bookshop at the back of the antique shop and just put up simple shelves and just put the books up. Priced them all at, I think they were 50 cents each, no matter what they were. And eventually a lot of them started moving. But we were interested in history books ourselves anyhow. And then we started buying. I used to buy in a place called Crown Alley, which is near Temple Bar. When you come off of the Penny Halfpenny Bridge and you're going into Temple Bar, you come through an archway. There's some steps up to it. And there was only one little shop in there. There was an old man. At the time I was only about 16. And he had one bulb and a big high stool behind a big high counter. And the place was absolutely full of antiquarian books. There wasn't anything less than a couple of 100 years old in it. And we used to buy a few off of him. He's well gone now. And eventually then, about 15 years ago, I got back into selling coins and books and collectibles again. So I started at the book trade again. Started going to book fairs and then eventually selling online.
It's interesting you mentioned Temple Bar, because I suppose it was the capital of book selling in not just Dublin but in Ireland. They had that kind of half-mile area through Temple Bar leading back down to the river where people had sold books for hundreds of years. So that shop you were talking about may have been the last of that connection to that old guard. I know there's a couple of shops that were set up there recently. Have you noticed much change since you returned to it 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that particular man now was an expert in antiquarian books. I mean, you could mention the book that was printed in 1550 in Amsterdam or something in Genoa, and he'd know what it was. There was Green's as well, the famous bookshop. They were still open, and they still had the stalls outside the windows. We used to buy books there, and there was another one up by the Gaiety, behind the Gaiety. So there was quite a lot of availability. I suppose the difference is that the internet now, there's far more databases and information about books than there was. In the old days it was very hard to know, who published it, when was the first edition, of what was a rare book and what wasn't a rare book. You had to take, there were certain books written about books, but they were even scarce. Whereas now you can actually research nearly everything online. And then the online business has come on as well, which has changed it all. And as you know yourself, the number of bookshops are disappearing really. There aren't that many bookshops where you can get a variety of books anymore. A lot of the new bookshops are reducing their offerings down to maybe I don't know, maybe 100 different titles or something.
Absolutely. When you returned to book selling 15 years ago, I suppose you were at the end of the modern book selling boom that a lot of dealers would talk about, and a lot of dealers that have left the business since would remember those days fondly. And then we entered the Amazon years when a lot of shops disappeared, a lot of dealers decided to retire, and we heard these incredible forecasts that people were going to stop reading books, that young people definitely wouldn't read books, and that Kindles were going to take over and electronic devices. And I think we've seen it here in the shop that young people are reading. They're reading more than ever, and the last people to be caught dead with a Kindle would be a young person. They would see it as just a completely uncool device. They want authentic books, they want authentic LPs, they want something physical that they can hold in their hands. You seem to stay with that since you took over the Wexford Book Fair. Many of the book fairs we visited, they are, I suppose they don't go out of their way to invite young people in. They don't go out of their way to reach that generation. A lot of them seem to think that that generation doesn't want to come to book fairs, but you've gone out of your way to make the Wexford Book Fair accessible to a younger generation. Do you feel that's really important?
Well, it is, in the sense that, well, firstly, I've always thought that Kindle was only a fashionable thing. I never really had any fear of it. I thought that people will play with this thing for a while and eventually they'll give it up. Young people have their own particular interests, and what they'll actually start to read when they're teenagers, they'll probably stay with that for a while and maybe move away from that then as they get older. But it's very important to get them reading, as you know yourself. Not just school books, but to read outside that box, so to speak. A lot of the book fairs were specifically set up for antiquarian books and collectible books, when there was a certain market for that. There wasn't really a push to sell books for people who just want to read. They're not necessarily going to collect them. They might pick up a paperback, read it, and then move on to the next book. So when you get the more contemporary writers, or the sci-fi books, or the fantasy books, or the crime books that you sell a lot in the shop, there's a particular market for that. If somebody doesn't actually put it out for sale, then the customers are not going to find it. They'd probably get them online, but it isn't always cheap online because you have to pay for the postage. So what we were doing in the Wexford Book Fair was to broaden out the appeal of the fair, to modernise it a little bit. It's been going over 50 years, so it obviously has to be reinvented every 10 years or so. So I brought in antique dealers, collectible dealers, and dealers like yourself who would be selling contemporary fiction, poetry, young writers, young readers, offerings for young readers that they're looking for at very affordable prices as well. I've often said to people, you don't need to have a fortune to collect books. Fine if you want to buy the rarest book, that's fine. Somebody will buy them, and people will invest in them maybe. But to me, if somebody just wants to read a good book, I'd say to them, buy the second edition or buy the third edition. You don't have to go for the first edition. But if you're a collector, or if you're very, very serious, you might go for the first edition. So the book fairs now in the Talbot, and in particular as well, Graignamanagh, the town of Books Festival, Fettered in Clonmel, outside Clonmel, they're appealing to people who wouldn't necessarily have any interest in an antiquarian book. They might know of, say, Gulliver's Travels, say, for instance. And if they wanted to read Gulliver's Travels, they're probably just as happy to buy a modern paperback edition of Gulliver's Travels. Whereas, you know, there's no point in showing them the first edition of Gulliver's, because, you know, it's going to be the price of a house, maybe. So that whole thing is to let it evolve itself, get the young people into reading, get them to collecting, get them to come to the fairs, to see the offerings, but also to mix as well, because you get a great mix of people there. You get, as you know yourself, you get people who are publishing books, people who are writing books, people who are... Of course,
there are some books that can't be got in modern paperbacks that you only find in at the book fairs and places like this.
Therein is the real crux of it. If you want to buy, say, for instance, what do I think now? So there's such a huge amount of books that have never been published a second time. And if you're into researching or maybe studying or maybe just following a particular author, then if you want to read that book, you have to get the original. And it doesn't mean that they're going to cost that they're going to be that expensive, but it isn't the age of the book that makes it valuable. It's actually it's availability. So if a book is scarce or rare, it might be hard to get it. So like there's books, as you know, Wexford books coming out every year, 200 print runs. Within 6 months they're rare. So if you want to say, you know, that book that we were talking about, Billy Sweetman's book, The Trials in County Wexford 1798, that's actually quite a rare book now. And it hasn't been reprinted. I don't know whether it ever will be reprinted. But if you're studying 1798 in depth, you have to get your hands on that. So where are you going to get it? Well, there's probably 2 or 3 of them available in the country at any one time at most. So that is the point of the book fairs, is that you can walk into a book fair and pick up a book that's very, very sought after, and the dealer will sell it for a reasonable enough price generally. In fact, you get better value at the book fairs than you will online anyhow.
Now, Ireland arguably has the oldest vernacular literature in Europe, aside from Greek, and I suppose Greek was preserved by the Irish during the Dark Ages, and the whole reputation of the land and saints and scholars. But we have this incredibly old oral storytelling tradition, and indeed an old written literature tradition, going back to the cycles. And I know you're very passionate about those old cycles, about that the mythology, the folklore of Ireland. And one of your great bugbears is modern books that bastardize these stories, that often written by people who are trying to cash in and may not understand the essence of the old story. You told me a great tale once when you were in school. You had a teacher who would read little stories from Irish folklore to you every week as a treat. And
yeah, I mean, when we went to primary school, Friday afternoons after lunch was story time and history. And that particular teacher would read from old books of Irish folklore, Irish histories, Irish mythology, whichever. Mostly he used to read from MacManus's The Story of the Irish Race. I remember that one. But he also read from Cuno O'Meyer's translations, or he'd read from Standish O'Grady's translations, from O'Halloran, from some of the other writers whose names I can't remember now, but they were all direct translations from very old ancient manuscripts, many of which were in the British Museum or the Irish Museum or the Irish Academy. These people spent their whole lives really dedicated to translating from Old Gaelic or from Latin or Greek into modern Gaelic first, and then into English. So if you take, say, like Keating's histories, while a lot of historians might say that it is in some ways is being disregarded because he didn't actually censor it. He travelled the country picking up manuscripts in big houses, translating bits and pieces, putting it all together, wrote it in Old Gaelic and Latin, and then it was translated a couple of hundred years after his time, around the 1890s, 1900, into English. And there's a set of those. And, you know, they go back to mythological times, to prehistory, into the great legends and the sagas, and then he comes all the way through into recorded history. So he's talking about maybe the old legends of the Dún Danam or the Fair Bullocks, or the various, you know, the battles of Maitura, or Cuchulainn, you know, the Táin, that sort of stuff. And there was so much done in the Gaelic revival, I suppose, from say about 1870 to maybe 1930, in that time. And those books are very available still. They're not very expensive. Standish O'Grady's books are really good. You can pick them up for about €10, first editions. And there's such a wealth of folklore, storytelling, children's stories. A lot of the modern stuff that I find, it's almost as if they're trying to reinvent it and put it into a different context, and filling in the gaps with what would be fashionable now, in the sense that they'll talk about a sort of a modern sense of magic, if you like. And they'll say, you know, that this, that, and what sort of I object to is them actually saying that they know more than the people who spent their lives translating these documents and finding these documents. And not just the documents, then you get the Folklore Commission. You know, I saw a documentary on the Folklore Commission one time on television where there was this man on a push bike, and his job was to cycle across the whole of Ireland. And on the back he had this sort of recording machine.
Yeah. And
with a big sort of, it looked like an old gramophone sort of thing. And he'd cycle down a boreen, or he'd go up a hill, or he'd find somebody who had a few stories from the local area, and he'd wind this thing up, and the person they'd record those particular stories. So when it came to then, like, stories, say, of the She, the She-Ogs, there's almost a disrespect, I think, nowadays in a lot of these modern books to the people who actually had a faith in those things and who kept those stories. Because it wasn't like that they possessed these stories as something to show how modern they were, or whatever. These were stories of the countryside. These were stories that went back for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And every village and every place in Wexford and in Ireland had some sort of a story. So I usually say to people, look, if you're interested in these things, go and find the really well researched books, and you'll find a very, very different.
But yet these traditions have made their way into modern Irish literature in a respectful manner as well, from Flann O'Brien, I suppose, popularising the Pucán, or the Puca, the Puca in America, to people like Blind Boy Boat Club now, who are obviously inspired by that kind of very Irish other realism.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really comes back to what you consider to be the Gaelic tradition, really. What do you consider to be the benefit of the Gaelic culture. And what do you actually mean by the Gaelic culture? It's a sense of awareness of that permeates society anyhow. We probably don't notice it as much, but people coming into Ireland will notice it. It's not this sort of diddly eye sort of Irish thing that invented for the American audience to create tourism. It's more a sense of being, and it is there, and I think you find that in the huge amount of people in Ireland who write poetry or write books. We probably have, I don't know what the statistics are, but I reckon we probably have more literary.
Absolutely. I think Joyce said you couldn't throw a stone in Dublin without hitting a writer, and it's certainly the way in Wexford at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and the great advantage is that we still are small enough in Ireland to be able to have independent publishers. We're still able to have independent bookshops. Red Books publications, you can still do it. Fair enough, it isn't all about publishing the next bestseller, and well, it'd be great if some of them did, but it may not happen that way. But it's more a tradition of bringing forward the great tradition of storytelling, being reflected now in literature or in poetry, and the great tradition of poetry, of course.
You've great faith in those old folk tales, that old mythology. Do you believe that there's more to it than just moral tales? I mean, in Wexford we have a great tale of the Bow, and you yourself told me many stories about the Bow.
Yeah, well, but there's a great danger in rationalising everything, I think, and I think the great advantage of Gaelic tradition and the Gaelic culture is that you're never too sure about things, and while they don't necessarily believe in everything, it doesn't mean they're going to disbelieve it, just in case. And I think that tradition of the spiritual and the metaphysical and the sort of the unknown, the other world, so to speak. In the advantage is that in Ireland it was quite safe to talk about it, or you could say you believe it or whatever, and a lot of people might foo that and say, well, that means nothing. But whereas in other countries that had been cleaned out a long time ago. I always put it back to the fact that we in Ireland, we never actually had witch hunts in Ireland. Whereas in Europe, in the witch hunts, they wiped out a whole generations of people who were closer to the spiritual world and confined them to strict religious beliefs.
Do you think?
Because we didn't, and we didn't have it, apart from a few in the Anglo-Irish towns maybe.
Yeah.
So that old tradition came all the way forward. Plus the fact that there wasn't great materialism to actually push it aside. So you had to. They held on to these things. Storytelling was their only entertainment. Music was their only entertainment. So I think that
and the stories weren't captured by an intellectual elite. They belonged to the people.
No, and there still are loads of more stories, and there's stories that were written down, and folklore that's been recorded once in books and has never been seen again and never even heard of again. And I've had books in my hand that you're just flicking through, even just the index, and you'd see a story about something, and you'd say, has anybody even heard of this since 1890 or 1905 or 1910? I think
many of those stories were kept alive with the old tradition of the story house, people calling, sitting around the bog fire.
and the Shanakees and all of that. Plus the fact that the schools as well, in fairness, at least the ones I remember. I don't know whether they do it anymore, but I think they should. And, you know, well, you still have some, I mean, there was a fellow called Jimmy O'D, you probably don't remember him, but he used to come onto the very early television for about 10 minutes between, I think it was 10 to 6 and 6 o'clock. And it was simple, because all he had was a bit of a table, and it was dark, and he'd just come on with a little candle, and he'd tell a story, an old story. And at the end of it, he'd just put out the candle with his finger and blow it out, and it was just blank, and then it moved on. And that was probably the influences of those things was quite strong. But I mean, that's the book trade, and you know yourself, like with the bookshop.
We still have Eddie Lenihan, of course, as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Funny man.
Now, you said there was no witch hunts in Ireland, but and certainly there wasn't during that period. But as we entered the 20th century and we established a free state, we did have an unprecedented level of censorship. Perhaps it was because we had such a great amount of writers for a small population. Perhaps it was because we'd gone through a revolutionary period and a particularly bloody civil war. But censorship of literature became a huge problem, an issue that extended into the 1980s and beyond. And some would say elements of that are resurfacing today.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it ironic really that so many of the early Republicans, so many of the 1916 people were poets and literary people, and were very open-minded in some senses, and yet within 15 years or 10 years after that, we went into a sort of a dark age of censorship. Why? You know, it happened. A lot of the best ones had to leave and write abroad, and then we sort of woke up to that, I think, and we've stepped away from it. The modern censorship, if you like, the modern type of stuff that's going on, it's peculiar because it's almost wrapped around in a sort of a wrapping of popularism, to say that, well, you know, you can't talk about that, you can't write that because that's not politically correct anymore. So that's only another form of censorship. You know, politically correct, what does that mean anyhow? That means that there's politically incorrect. So what's incorrect? And who decides what's correct and what's incorrect? I mean, if somebody wants to write, unless something is absolutely outrageous, and it's almost to the point of being dangerous, I think there shouldn't be any censorship, because leave it up to if the people want to read it, let them read it. That's my view. As long as it's not sort of a neo-Nazi or racist or
the one thing censorship of literature down through the ages has always had in common is the future generations have always condemned it. They've looked back on it as being extremely backward, but yet the people who went through those times were convinced that they were right. The majority were convinced that they were in the right. When books were being burned in Nazi Germany, they were being burned by educated students and their lecturers. When they were being seized in America, it was again done on college campuses with the full support of the students and the intellectuals. When it was being done here, it was with the support, the full support of the state, of all political parties, and of the church, and of the intellectuals, the media, the journalists. And no doubt, once again, in 50 years, people will look back on this as possibly the start of a dark age.
Yeah, I think this political correctness is just a fad myself. I think that it's going to be called out eventually, in the sense that it's not truly Republican in a sense. you know, if the essence of Republican is liberty, freedom, equality, fraternity, you know, there has to be a liberty to speak your mind. Now, I don't mean you can stand up and start saying, you know, things that are just so wrong historically that, you know, like saying Hitler didn't kill the Jews, like, for instance. I don't think I'd go as far as saying that you should have a right to give lectures on that. Or that, you know, that the famine didn't happen in Ireland. And as you know, lately we've had people saying that the famine was our own fault. I mean, where did that notion come from? There's plenty of good books that'll dissuade anybody as to whether or not, and I'm not talking about political books, I'm talking about factual books, factual historic books. I think that there's a danger of a commonality in society now. You know, you've often said it to me, you know, you go into towns now and they all look the same. It's all the same shops. You go into the shops, they're all the same things. You know, is there anything different at all? Well, there is, of course, but you have to go find them. So, you know, what these modern marketeers call, you know, your unique selling point or whatever. People are searching for that. What is it that makes you different from your competitors? What makes Red Books different from the competitors? Well, it's the fact that it doesn't have any sense of telling the buyer what they should be reading. I think it's the opposite way around. You just stock as much as you can of all different types of books. Old ones, new ones, everything that anybody can ask for, and you just pack the place as you've done with tens of thousands of books, and you let somebody walk in, and eventually somebody comes in and asks for that oddest thing that nobody in a bookshop would probably think of actually stocking.
Where can people find your collection? You're online?
I'm online. In the website is o'brienbooks.ie. And
you have some of your books here at Red Books in St. Peter's Square in Wexford.
Books, yeah, and I sell on AB Books, and I sell on eBay, and at the book fairs.